We all talk about fake news now, right? But fake news really isn't new at all. Today, 90% of the media is actually in the hands of 6 companies, which shape our sense of reality. I say sense of reality because, like truth, you cannot have your own reality, only your own perspective. What is said and not said has enormous consequences, some deadly, as documented by tonight's speaker in his substantial book, The Gray Lady Winked, How the New York Times' Misreporting, Distortions, Fabrications radically alter history. His research reports into World War II, Stalin's brutality, Vietnam, the Iraq War, critical theory, and more illustrate how glaring omissions, lack of context, and full-out lies have significant consequences. Fresh in our minds of such manipulation is, of course, the tragic and staggering campaign to repress, shadow ban, and block any discussion of alternative treatments and responses to the COVID drama and its origins that fall outside the sanctioned narrative, as well as the attacks and defamation of those who dare question the safe and effective claim. Tonight's guest, here to discuss the great cost of bias, is an author, essayist, and novelist. Born in South Africa, raised in the United States, educated at Cornell, he spent 20 years living in Israel. And tonight, all the way from England, please help me welcome investigative journalist Ashley Rindsberg.
Thank you to Jane. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, am I good? And thank you all to you guys. Thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me and welcoming me. This is actually my first time back in the Bay Area in something like 25 years. I used to live in San Francisco right after university. I got a job with the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine guys. And you all know that the task is to save what's there, preserve it, so it can be a record, a historical record. And that was, to me, something very important in the early days. Preserve the thing so that you can refer to it. And part of what we understand from this concept is the principle of openness. That was very important, and still probably is very important to the founder of the archive, Brewster Kahle, and it's very important to me too. It's about searching. Jane mentioned the truth and the importance of the truth in matters of control. Because what do we control first? Reality. We learned that from history, learned it from the Soviets, and we learned it from George Orwell in 1984, is that if you really want to control what people do, the behaviors that they take, control what they think, but if you want to control what they think, you need to control what they know. So I have a really unique insight into the business of control. We call it the mainstream media. And that's because I've been in the media, I've been out of the media. An outsider has written this book about the media, and I've been sort of in the gray zone between the media and the outside, which is PR, really. It's sort of this ambiguous, neither here nor there. So I've gotten a really good view of the media over the last 20 years. As a former New York Times daily reader and subscriber to someone who wrote the book about why the New York Times is lying to us all, and everything in between the middle there. So that's why, for me, this is an important moment, especially considering everything we experienced during COVID regarding the media. And that's how I actually got into the question of where did the virus come from. It's something that I reported on. It took me to one of the world's leading experts who's sitting right here, Dr. Bhattacharya. And I think this is the moment where we're all starting to sense that something is going very wrong with a lot of our institutions, in particular the media. Because again, you can only be controlled if they can control what you know, or at least shape the narrative to some significant extent. So I just want to ask you a sort of hands-up question, which is, how many of you out there think that the media has a problem, a big problem? Which is okay, so that's... Okay, so that's kind of everybody. I should have asked who doesn't think that. I might have gotten a more intelligible response. But here's a different question. How many of you think that the media is the problem? Okay, so majority, but not every single one of you. And I think you're all right in both instances to say that the media has a problem. We can all see that. The media can also see that. They know. They call it the trust crisis, but the trust crisis puts the onus on us because it's our problem if it's a trust crisis. We don't trust enough. Where what I call this is a reliability crisis. The media is not reliable enough for us to even consider it to be credible. Forgetting trust. Trust is a whole other realm. We've lost that long ago. We are now just seeking credibility. Can I even possibly believe this? That is the question. But you know, I think the problem with the media and this conversation about the media and what's happened in the last, let's say, 6, 7, or 8 years with the media is that the baby can be thrown out with the bathwater. And I say this because in the epigraph of my book is a quote by none other than Thomas Jefferson, who said the following: "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." Why? Because knowledge is freedom. And governments are, by nature, have a tendency to restrict freedom. That is part of their job, is to constrain our freedoms so that other freedoms can flourish instead. But Jefferson, I think, had a really important point, which is that you cannot have a democracy, and I think history probably shows that we did not have a democracy without a thriving, healthy media. And I'm not sure that that's what we have today. So just to think a little bit about where we are and why I wrote this particular book about this particular newspaper, right? There's a lot of news organizations in the world today that are doing equally as bad a job as the New York Times. Why not choose the BBC or one of the broadcast networks or even a digital network or what have you? The reason for me the New York Times was so important is because it is literally synonymous with the people who have a monopoly on the truth. What does the newspaper print on their newspaper edition every single day? All the news that's fit to print. That's their motto, their slogan. And they really believe that, and that's good that they do. The problem is that the New York Times has become so taken with its own notion of truth and its belief that it alone and maybe a few of its peers can have a handle on that truth, that they have started to shut everyone out of that space. You don't leave a lot of room for other people to talk. So there's one reason, which is the symbolic reason of the New York Times' significance. All around the world, you say the New York Times, people know what you're talking about. There is really just no gap. They're the #1 news brand in terms of prestige, at least, and they set the news agenda for the rest of the media. That's a key thing to understand. At the Times, they come first. Everyone else kind of looks to them to see where the coverage is going. And that's a power structure because if you're a journalist in today's world, you, A, probably really would like to work at the New York Times one day, and B, really would not like to piss anyone off who's doing the hiring at the New York Times today or down the line. But then the New York Times' actual impact and their actual power is enormous because it's not just a single newspaper. It is a web of syndication, licensing deals, content deals. That means that its content, its daily production reaches multiples of its actual readership. So if they have, let's say, hundreds or even thousands of syndication and licensing deals, all their stories are going out all over the world, and that has been the case for a very long time. And it's what's given the New York Times so much of its heft in the world, and why we think about it in this unique manner. But I would say there's a third aspect here, which is that it really is symbolic of what we're seeing in the media today, changes we're seeing, problems that we're seeing, and it just became a very good lens to see the media through. One question about the media that I often get asked about is, did it change or was it always this bad? And I can understand why people would ask that, because it is pretty bad, and it feels like it's getting worse every day. But what I discovered in my book was that it was actually always pretty bad, unfortunately. So, you know, I won't talk chronologically, I'll just kind of skip out of order here a little bit. But one of the most impactful stories that came out of my book when I was researching it was the story of the New York Times' role in World War II. So in Germany, in New York, in World War II, or the lead up to to World War II, when the Times was reporting on this newcomer on the political stage in Bavaria and in Germany, they were talking about this young Hitler in these terms that kind of still blow your mind. They talked about a Hitler who they considered to be actuated by a lofty patriotism, lofty, unselfish patriotism. This is Hitler they're describing. They talked about a young Hitler who came out of prison in Germany and was likely just retire to his Bavarian hill and never to be heard from again. That was a prediction from the New York Times. And it got progressively worse and worse and worse until we get to the Berlin Olympics in 1936, where most of the newspapers in the United States are saying, no thank you, we're going to boycott this one for obvious reasons. This was Hitler. And the New York Times called it the greatest sporting event of all time in their gigantic story they did about beautifully clean streets and the German athletic prowess and every bit of German propaganda that Goebbels and his henchmen wanted printed in the West was printed by the New York Times. And the reason for this is because the man who ran their bureau in the 1930s was a Nazi. He was a Nazi sympathizer is how he was described. I would actually call him a collaborator because he collaborated with the Nazis. And when it came time to round up all the American journalists in Germany after the war was officially declared, there was one who was left off of that list. He was allowed to stay in his luxury hotel in Berlin, and that was this man named Guido Inderis, the New York Times Berlin bureau chief during those crucial years where his reporting was so pro-Nazi that the Nazis would read the New York Times reports on German broadcast, radio broadcast, without changing a word. And when he was left in his Berlin hotel room to enjoy the luxuries of the city life while his other American fellow journalists were locked up in a frozen chalet under SS guard, the official reason given by the Nazis was because of his proven friendliness to Germany during those years. Now, does it get worse than that? I'm not sure. This is the Nazis we're talking about. But what we have with the Times is just case after case where they get history wrong on the most enormous level possible. And that also happened with Walter Duranty, sort of the most infamous example. A lot of you will have heard that name. He denied the Ukraine famine. Stalin, after coming to power, shortly does what Stalin does, which is kill millions of people, in this case in Ukraine. These are peasants, and murders them through starvation. And the New York Times denied it. The New York Times printed stories saying there was no famine. And other reporters from around the world were saying, of course there is. We can see it with our own eyes. Walter Duranty knew that there was a famine. This is something I write about. He estimated on the high end of the number of deaths in private to fellow journalists. And the question there being, why? So the New York Times official explanation about Walter Duranty was that he was a rogue reporter. He kind of went off on his own to do this denialism. It wasn't a communist. It wasn't a Marxist. He just rogue. This never made sense to me because what do journalists love above all things? A scoop. You want a scoop that says this is happening or this happened. No journalist wants the story to say nothing to see here. Move along. They want the story that's going to get them the big prize. Duranty was an ambitious man. He was trained in Cambridge. He spoke Russian fluently. He was a polyglot. He was self-taught, and he was educated on top of his own learning. And he knew very well what was going on, and he was ambitious, and he wanted that story. Why would he turn it down? Because most likely this was a financial interest. The New York Times ownership was part of a very small, powerful, and wealthy coterie, this clique of industrialists in that period. This was only 16 years after the Soviets had taken control in Russia. The United States did not recognize the Soviets as the official government of Russia, and that meant that there were trade barriers. That this group of railroad people, bankers, people who are manufacturing things in the US wanted to open up this market of rapidly industrializing peoples. Over 100 million people is a major market, and they couldn't do that until the United States recognized the Soviets as the official government of Russia. And when that actually did happen, after Walter Duranty personally advised President Roosevelt to do so in person, and Roosevelt came into office, was elected, and then within about a year made that diplomatic recognition of the Soviets of Russia. There was a gala event in New York celebrating this, and only one single man received a standing ovation. That was Walter Duranty, because everyone in that room understood that without Duranty denying that there had been a mass famine, no American would ever have accepted Roosevelt giving diplomatic recognition to this regime that had just murdered 5 million of its own people. So there again, we have this very strange story of the New York Times putting its hand right into the guts of history and kind of giving it a twist. And we see it again in the case of the atomic bomb, where the New York Times made an explicit deal with the Department of Defense to deny that there's any such thing as radiation poisoning as a result of the atomic weapons. And in exchange, they got ultimate exclusive access, the best VIP backstage access you could ever imagine, which is having their reporter, William Lawrence, on one of the planes that was bombing, on the bombing run of Nagasaki, and giving him access to everything that was going on at the Manhattan Project. A super secret, completely closed project, except for one media reporter, media figure, who also just happened to go on to do a bit of propaganda for the Department of War, as it was called at the time. So when we talk about has it gotten worse or has it just always been this way, I think in general the answer to that question is that the New York Times has sort of always been this way. The media in general I think actually has gotten worse, but the reason the New York Times has always been this way is because it's always been controlled by the same people, which is one family. It's a dynasty, and they have controlled this newspaper, and as much as they want to talk about woke values and DEI, they've handed down the reins of that paper from male heir to male heir to male heir. All of them are named Arthur Sulzberger, by the way, for the last 10 to 12 decades, which is pretty remarkable. It's probably one of the last true remaining American power industrial dynasties that we have today still operating in the world. People don't think about that because this family, the Sulzbergers, never appear in the media. Why? Back to what I'd said about the media before. Everyone wants a job at the New York Times and no one wants to piss them off. So we don't see this story about the New York Times and its ownership being told, but that's really what is driving this kind of very strange zigzagging at the paper. One year they are pro-Nazi, the next year they're pro-communist. It doesn't make any sense until you just think about power and wealth in the hands of a very few number of people in New York City who happen to own a news organization and not a railroad or an agricultural concern or something else. So back to this question about things getting worse or not, I think we've actually hit a tipping point. And I think we hit that tipping point in the last 6 to 7 years. Certainly it began with the election of Donald Trump, where what we saw was really quite remarkable. And of course, this happened at the New York Times probably to a greater extent than most places. But we really saw journalists and editors and publishers coming out to say, actually, we're not going to try to do the old objectivity, neutrality thing, because that might make Trump look better than he is. We need to go full bore at the bias thing and call it moral clarity. And they sort of just said it on the newspapers themselves. They said it in op-eds. Their editors talked about this need to basically wage some kind of war, an intellectual, moral war against what they saw as a demonic figure of Donald Trump. And that's all very well, and everyone can have their own opinions and they're entitled to it. The problem is that once you break down these barriers, such as the need for neutrality in journalism or objectivity, or even more importantly, that simple word of truth, then you leave the system open to an even bigger infection. And what we saw in that regard was, of course, COVID. So once the media had come out in, let's say it was 2016 and 2017, this started to gather some more steam, where the media is coming out and saying, no, we actually have to be biased. If we treat Trump fairly, and there was an instance where the New York Times wrote a headline that kind of made it seem like Trump was considering a little bit of gun control, and people on the left went absolutely crazy because they thought it was too good of a headline for him. So this was the kind of thing where they were editorializing openly and they were embracing that. And then what happens is they come along with COVID, where now we've been given permission, we've given ourselves permission to do what is necessary with the truth when times call for it, drastic measures type approach to journalism. And then COVID comes along and say, now we have the greatest possible use case for our newfound lack of objectivity, or I don't know how you want to call that, just the tendency to lie, with COVID. Because COVID, people needed to have the narrative. This was no longer about a political position or getting a little bit of an edge on a policy issue. This was life and death, mass extinction. If you didn't believe the narrative, you were just destroying humanity. That became sort of the party line. And the journalists had already said, they'd already made this big declaration about Trump saying, we can remove these barriers, we can remove the ramparts of journalism that keep things objective and neutral, and instead now we have this whole new structure we've built up about doing what's necessary when it's either ideologically or morally necessary, and we can use that. And as we saw, that sort of is exactly what happened. My own experience with this was really to do with the origin of the virus. I came into this story through the media. I saw that the media was covering the origin of COVID in a very particular way. And this is something else Jay can attest to, which is that they kind of, I mean, there was just no subtlety. There wasn't even any kind of attempt at nuance. It was just, if you think this could have come from, not that you do think it came from a lab, if you think it could have come from a lab, you are, now take your pick of expletives, conspiracy theorist, racist. I mean, they basically just pulled everything out and threw it, and it worked. It worked well enough for people to say, oh wait, I'm not any of those things. So no, I didn't really mean it. I think, yes, I agree this had to have come from an animal, you're right. That was the narrative that was established so quickly and with just sort of blunt force, because like I said, there wasn't a lot of skill involved in implementing this. It was just done through sheer force. The New York Times began reporting on the conspiracy theory idea that this virus came from a lab in mid-February 2020. This is before a pandemic was declared. How they could have known that at that point, how anyone could have done any kind of investigation is beyond me and probably anyone in this room, because none was done and nobody at that point knew anything. But the New York Times took it upon itself, along with the Washington Post, to call it a conspiracy theory. And from that moment forward, and that's sort of what I was talking about earlier in this talk, the New York Times, the narrative trickles down through the media. So they come out with this conspiracy theory idea. The only exception to the trickle down, actually, and this is a really interesting little point, was that 1 week prior to the New York Times calling this a conspiracy theory, China Daily, which is the Chinese English language propaganda organ for the CCP, printed the exact same claim in very similar language, which is not to say that the New York Times went and plagiarized a China Daily article. I don't think that's true, even though at this time, during this same period, the New York Times, along with a lot of other mainstream outlets in the United States, were taking money from China Daily for advertising. China Daily would advertise inside of the New York Times and other newspapers, and there was an exchange of presumably a lot of money. We actually don't know how much money, because nobody ever reported it, despite their obligation to do so, to report with the Justice Department, but they didn't. But what the effect was to shut that debate down in its entirety. For over 2 years, what we heard was conspiracy theory, fringe theory, racist theory. And that never sounded right to me, because it seemed a little bit too coarse of a stroke to paint everybody with, even if you were just asking a few simple questions, which is what I did. I started to dig into that question, and what I found was things that were pretty simple and on the record. I mean, none of this was hidden. Things about the real role that Anthony Fauci plays in the American government, which is not as the godfather of pandemic responses, but as the head of biodefense in America. I mean, that wasn't nobody had reported that, to my knowledge, until then. And I didn't work for the Washington Post or the New York Times or USA Today or any of the big news organizations. I was just an independent reporter looking for the facts and came across this very important fact that hadn't been put out there. And this is part of where we see the media manipulating through what we call selection bias. What they choose to report, very important, but what they choose not to report is much more important. And this is one of those things that we just never saw made it into the media regarding Fauci, what he was doing there, why he had this role that wasn't legally prescribed for him to take in that moment. But the media really found a way to line up because they had been so accustomed to doing so when they went through the Russiagate debacle. They had already learned the system. They had already taken down those moral and intellectual instruments to keep things like this from happening. And they did it for a political motive, but now we had a motive that was more universal and hit us on a more deep level. But I think what we're seeing now is that, so we had this first change with the media. The media did actually accelerate its approach into a crazy form of bias, which I actually don't think is bias. Bias is just something we all have as human beings. We have perspectives. What it is more of an agenda. It's an agenda that has become increasingly centralized with that part of the media, the legacy media, or mainstream media, however you want to call it. That has been a huge flip since the election of Trump, and it's accelerating. And we've seen that with the Twitter files, just to the extent to which media, and I'll include social media here for a broad definition, were colluding with the government to carry the message, or again, to quash a different kind of message that was not acceptable. So that is something that's really changed, and that's a big flip. But we're also seeing another big flip underway right now, which is that people are kind of getting to the point where they've had enough, and they just don't believe the media anymore. So, you know, there's this theory of media, which it's called, I think, the Gell-Mann theory. He was a physicist who came up with the idea with the author Michael Crichton, between the two of them, that, you know, you can open up a newspaper, and if you're a doctor, or maybe if you work in construction or whatever you do, you read something about the topic that you know about, and you're like, oh, well, that's obviously all false from like top to bottom. That's just not true. And then you continue to read the rest of the newspaper, and you believe the rest of the newspaper, right? You have a kind of temporary amnesia. And that is usually the case. Usually what happens is the New York Times has a Nazi in its Berlin bureau, or it doesn't cover the Holocaust at all, or it does what it did with Fidel Castro, which is elevated him onto the world stage and sort of shoehorned him into the dictatorship. And then people just have the amnesia. They forget. It just doesn't matter that much. And right or wrong, it just makes no difference. That's the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. What we've learned from COVID is that the Gell-Mann amnesia effect does not apply when something hits every single one of us on a gut level, when it changes our entire life, when it restricts our kids from going to school, from loved ones from going to ceremonies, to go to funerals or weddings, or to tell you to stay home and don't go eat at a restaurant. Then the amnesia effect is not in effect. Then we actually really remember. And part of the reason I got into reporting on the origin of COVID is because of some yellow tape, some yellow police tape that someone in my town decided was a good idea to wrap around the playground that my kids would play at. My kids were 2 and 3 at the time, and they didn't understand. They'd look at this and saying, what's going on over there? We didn't even have an explanation. There was no explanation for that. And that too was when my own Gell-Mann amnesia effect was gone. I never will forget that, and I will never let it go. And somebody did that, and this is the important thing. Somebody did that, and I'm not a politician, and I'm not in science, and I don't have that kind of ability to take on and challenge the people who did it, but I can talk a lot about the people who failed to investigate it, or the people who carried a narrative in the service of power that said something that was just completely not true. So this is the kind of thing that I think a lot of us feel today, is that we still carry this one with us. this shift that we're seeing as a result of this, it's coincided with technological shifts. So what we've seen in technology is infinite distribution. You can distribute any piece of information anywhere at any time at zero cost. And we already started to see what that was doing to journalism. It had an impact on the advertising business of journalism, of course. But now what we started to see is this complete splintering and fragmenting of the journalistic ecosystem, where independent journalism has gone one step further and is now becoming something very close to what I call decentralized media, decentralized journalists. And that has taken a variety of forms. That can be as simple as a Substack. Someone who's decided maybe they're an area expert or maybe they're a concerned citizen, but now they are the outlet for some kind of idea or insight or truth, or even reporting a fact about an event in their world, and rather than it all running through a news organization or some other kind of centralized institution. So that is an enormous change being powered by technology. But I think the bigger change, and by far the more profound change, is the way that everybody today knows what we raised our hand about at the beginning of this talk, which is that the media has a very big problem, and for some of us, that it is the very big problem. This is something that people understand in their gut today. They don't trust the media, as we've talked about. But what this means is that 1 out of 10 or 2 or 3 or 4 out of 10 of those people are going to sign up for a Substack, or they're going to check out a YouTube channel for news, or they're going to be participating with news that's being investigated on Twitter. So for all the shoddy journalism that the New York Times and its peers did or did not do on COVID, by far, I think one of the most impactful, important organizations for the investigation of the origin of COVID is actually not an organization. It's called Drastic. And I'm going to read this one this is the acronym: Decentralized Radical Autonomous Search Team Investigating COVID-19. What is that really? These are just a bunch of Twitter users. Some of them are data scientists, some of them are geneticists, some of them are virologists, some of them are none of those things, and just people with an interest in understanding what actually happened and where this virus came from. Drastic, as a decentralized news group, informal, with no leadership structure, no funding, did more serious investigation into the origin of this virus than any newsroom in America. I'm pretty sure about that. And this is a story that's waiting to be told because it's an inflection point. Another inflection point along these same lines was SBF, and probably not an unfamiliar name around these parts. Sam Bankman-Fried was the infamous CEO and founder of FTX. And when you go back, and you can actually, if you want to Google this, I wrote a story about it for Tablet Magazine. But if you go back and look at the media's coverage of SBF over, let's say, the two years or so of his rapid rise to this celebrity, what you're going to see from the New York Times and NPR and all the usual suspects is this story about a genius altruist who's out to save the world. Kara Swisher, who's one of the most cynical people in tech as a journalist, has this gushing quote about SBF as how he's giving banks to the bankless and doing this whole thing about this golden heart that this genius has. And again, okay, maybe they were duped. That happens, right? He wouldn't be the first. But nobody in the entire media for 2 years that they're pumping this guy up decided to look like who's on the board of this company, what do their financials look like, what's their governance look like. Before we do the next puff piece, maybe we should just check. But nobody did. And it wasn't just that they missed the scandal, which they did. It was that they spent those 2 years turning SBF into a larger-than-life figure. He would never have been able to perpetrate what he did without that iconic brand that he achieved, that he paid for with advertising money, much like China Daily, to these news organizations, and they took his money without asking a single question, despite the fact that they run news organizations whose sole purpose is to investigate people like this. So SBF was another turning point. Why? Because the case was really cracked open by decentralized journalists by a Twitter user, Richard Chen, who's a VC, a crypto VC, a friend of mine as well. He happened to note that SBF was working to shape regulation about crypto behind the scenes with policymakers that he was donating to. And this tweet actually had an impact. Richard is someone who's known in that community. And importantly, it came timed to the CoinDesk article exposing the actual fraud, which is that SBF was just taking money out of people's accounts and using it for himself and for his influence machine. And again, why is that so important? Is because that, until that point, I would say was the financial scandal of this decade, was broken not by the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or the Guardian, but maybe 2 Twitter accounts and 1 crypto newspaper. That is an enormous shift in the way things are done in media. It was unthinkable. What we're seeing with Tucker Carlson, which, like him or hate him, the same with Vladimir Putin, like him or hate him, but he scored an interview that would have been absolutely unthinkable 5 years ago for a journalist not affiliated with a major news organization to achieve. We're entering into, we're already in a new world for media. The question is, how far is it going to go? And I think this is really where the Silicon Valley aspect of this talk comes in, because there are exciting new technologies in AI, of course, and in crypto and blockchain that make truly decentralized media a possibility. And what does that mean? It means, let's take a really simple example. You live in a town, there might be crime increasing. You want to know about gunshots. Are there gunshots being let off in the night? You get a feeling that the police is kind of hushing it up. Well, if you have a sensor, you can measure it. You can measure gunshots in a city or a town with a sensor. That sensor can be brought onto chain, made available for people to interpret. And then someone at the end of that can write a Substack about crime in your locality, even a local neighborhood, doesn't have to be an entire town. And now you have decentralized the news gathering process, because the point where the information is gathered doesn't pass through a human first. It first passes through sensors, then it goes to a database, and then we can all interpret it the way we want to interpret it. But what matters there is that facts come first. And that's a very different model from the Walter Duranty model or the Guido Inderis model, where what we have is the thesis comes first, the agenda comes first, the narrative comes first, and facts, if they make it in, sort of come trailing after. So by putting technology at the center of a system, we can do important things. And also just by what you could call the Uber effect. So Uber, if you didn't like taxis in the 1990s and early 2000s, then you would be looking for a bicycle because there wasn't an option. Uber gave you another option. And I think that's what we're seeing with media today, is that we have other options. These are still not disrupting the product, the news product. We have Craigslist destroyed the news model, the advertising model for the news industry, but they didn't actually disrupt the product, because we're still reading New York Times for the most part. We're still reading news organizations and consuming their news. This, I think, is sort of the next step of where we go in the decentralization of media. What does that mean? It means that, for example, today, if you have a grandkid or a kid or get a new dog or a job, you don't run to your local newspaper and ask them to tell all your friends about your happy event. You just tell your friends directly. In business, as an example, everyone still runs to TechCrunch or FT or the Wall Street Journal to tell the people important to them about their news when they can just tell them directly. These are the kinds of things, and this attitude of go direct is going to be increasingly important as we go into the future, as technology and increased distribution make decentralized media a lot more of a reality. So I think I can sort of leave it there. I think we have a few more minutes. The one thing I will tell you, a quick anecdote, was when a COVID anecdote. I was on Tucker Carlson's show in Florida, and this was during the heaviest of the lockdown days. I was living in Israel, which was particularly egregious. And to get to Tucker, Israel made it they banned going to America if you were Israeli, which I'm an Israeli citizen. So I escaped to Florida from Israel through Germany, so they would, which I think is the first time a Jew has escaped Israel through Germany to America, but those were weird times. They still are. So thank you so much again for being a great audience and for having me here today. I really appreciate it.
Where to begin? One of the questions I have is thinking about the Uyghurs. Is the coverage of the plight of the Uyghurs similar to the coverage of the plight of the Jews? Is that a fair comparison?
Yeah, definitely. We know that there is or has been something that looks a lot like a genocide going on in China for the last 3-4 years. The Uyghur people, it's
Uyghur, pardon me, Uyghur. I apologize
yeah, I
for
think
that.
there's probably multiple pronunciations, but it's an ethnic minority in China, Muslim. They have been rounded up and put in concentration camps. And I would challenge anyone in this room to find recent coverage of what's going on with the Uyghur people in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. I don't see it. I look for it. And the comparison Jane's making to the Holocaust is that the New York Times also buried the Holocaust for many reasons. They didn't report it. And I think what we're seeing is an analogy today. The New York Times has a great financial interest in the Chinese market, and they know exactly what happens if they cross the line that the CCP has for reporting on certain things. And they've crossed that line once, and they still have no access to the Chinese market, and they're trying to win it back. So I think what we're seeing is something that is a politically motivated cover-up of a genocide, a financially motivated cover-up.
Okay. Question from the audience. Any thoughts on TikTok? Decentralization, but maybe worse than mainstream. And it obviously has a huge influence on a lot of people, particularly young people.
Yeah, TikTok, it's a tough one because there's an impulse in me that wants to say, ban it. I mean, this is a CCP propaganda mechanism. They have restrictions on it in China. They have a different app in China altogether. The content is different. But then at some point you think to yourself, well, the United States government can't just ban every app it doesn't like. What is the rhetoric? What is the rubric? What is the criteria for banning a piece of technology? I can't see how you would make that decision in a consistent way that would gel with constitutional freedoms on speech and other things. Then again, at what point, at how much harm does it have to do till we get to a point where we all realize something has got to change? So I don't know the answer.
Could you also speak to the coverage or lack of coverage about the Abrams Accord? Is that a similar?
Yeah, that's I could see people have different views about Donald Trump, which makes sense. But I think there is a legitimate question about when the world changes and people just kind of pretend it didn't, which is what we had with the Abraham Accord. So that is actually peace in the Middle East. I mean, I lived there during that period. It wasn't that long ago. But the idea that one day I could wake up and just fly to Dubai and do business there as an Israeli is crazy. It's still crazy to me. To the idea that we were on the brink of creating peace with Saudi Arabia is not a reality I had ever imagined. That was actually a product of this policy initiative, the Abraham Accords. We had almost heard nothing about it. There have been no big books. And that's another thing about the way the media works, of course, is that publishing is an extension of the news media, or it's some kind of like symbiosis between the two of them. You don't get the big books. You don't get the podcasts of how it all went down. It's as if it didn't really happen.
I don't know. I'm going to throw you a big question, okay?
Sure.
What is incorrect and correct about how American mainstream media is covering up the Israel-Gaza war?
Correct and incorrect. So some things, I think that the the hard thing about covering a war of any kind is the time scale. So the news has to be reported the same day. I mean, that's the definition of news. Sometimes that is just not possible because you don't know what happened. You don't know where the bomb came from. We saw early on the hospital bombing that was initially blamed on Israel, was subsequently found by Israel and the United States to have not been an Israeli bomb. But the Times has to put out the news that same day. And this is kind of where things get tricky, because what we saw was the same effect that led them to make their WMD blunder, which is that they wanted to grab that coverage. They were expanding. They wanted to be the big, robust national newspaper, not some sort of like Upper East Side kind of, squishy lefty thing that they thought they were being perceived as. And that led them to take a very different attack editorially when it came to Judy Miller reporting on WMD. So you have these kinds of impulses that are at odds with each other. I don't know how you judge what's good or bad. I think the Times has rushed to judgment on a couple occasions with Israel recently, and that has led to very bad outcomes because it has an impact. Sometimes waiting is better, but news organizations, I don't think, have that ability for whatever reason.
So while we're on the subject of Israel, Hamas attacked Israel on Simchat Torah, which is a holy day for Jews that celebrates the Torah, which is called the First Testament, or the Old Testament, right, by Christians, right? Do you think that had significance in terms of what we are perceiving as the war on Western civilization, Western culture, basically Judeo-Christian values?
Yeah, to me, I wrote an article not long after that, because I don't think it was a coincidence that October 7th was a border failure. Because we're seeing a lot of border issues around the world today. And in Israel's case, Israel has a strong border in the sense that it's not letting thousands or millions of migrants across it. But it has a weak border in a different sense, which is kind of a moral or the border that we have culturally, to know that this is how we define ourselves, and we're able and willing to protect it at all times. So I think Israel got a little bit lost in this notion that it was ready to have a great future. It was being opened to the region, and they could celebrate without worrying about the border. But you obviously can never do that, and I think that was a lesson that Israel will take with it for a long time, unfortunately.
Okay. So there are a couple of questions. I'm going to gather them because people wonder about, does the Associated Press have ties to China? Could you comment on the Trusted News Initiative, NewsGuard? Could you fill us in a little bit about your sense of that?
Yeah.
Maybe define that for people who aren't familiar with it.
So NewsGuard is an organization I've had a little experience with. Basically what they are is two former Wall Street Journal editors had an idea, which is there should be some sort of like a credit agency for media. So like just as Experian will tell you if this person is creditworthy or not, then we'd have this organization over here called NewsGuard tell you if this news organization is reliable or not. They get a green or a red score or whatever. And you can see which way their views line up just because of what people get dinged on. So a lot of the COVID stuff would get a red flag immediately if they were writing about origin, about vaccine transmission questions, about natural immunity. This would just automatically, and what they would actually do is call or email these news organizations and talk to them about the very sentence they wanted removed from a single article. And then they say, and if you do it, we'll give you your green score back. Which they actually never give you the green score back. This is what I've discovered through this. So they kind of get you to keep taking another behavior, another change, another edit, another deletion, and you're always chasing that green score, and that's NewsGuard. So be wary.
So the word guard gets a little twist there.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
I'm always amazed by the audacity of how people name things exactly the opposite of what they are, right? The Trusted News Initiative, that one really is amazing to me.
Yeah.
Right, okay. So we think that we're customers of the media, but that's not actually true anymore, right? When was that ever true, that we were customers of the New York Times, for instance? Were we? Or we,
Yeah, we were. We were when advertising played a bigger role, because if it's advertising kind of had a democratizing effect on media, because every pair of eyeballs is worth the same as everyone else. So it didn't matter if your base had some more radical ideas than you still had to think about the rest of the readership that was seeing the ads. Today, that's sort of changed, actually, where news organizations are returning to a subscription model. There's no more money in advertising for media. And what that means is that they have a base that might be just 2 or 3% of their total readership that's actually paying, our subscribers. And what they do, and this is exactly what the New York Times has done, they cater to that base on the most important stories. For example, the 1619 Project. It's not a coincidence that they chose this extremely woke project to go after their very young millennial base, their customer base of the 2 to 3% of readers that actually subscribe.
so one of our audience members says, where do you get your news?
Yeah, my wife says I get too much of it, which I think is probably true. I search, when we look at, and again, this is back to what I was talking about with regard to disrupting news at the product level. When you think about Spotify or Netflix, Spotify is an even better example, because you all remember, I assume, that once upon a time, if you wanted a song, you had to buy the album, right? Or the record or whatever it was. Today, that's no longer true. You just go choose the song that you want, Spotify or on YouTube or wherever. With news, that's still the case. If you want to read this article at whatever newspaper, you need to subscribe to that newspaper. And I think that is where we're seeing this effect, where we've seen an unbundling of content in video and music, but in news, it's still bundled together. What I try to do is unbundle it myself. So it's not that I'm looking at the New York Times as credible and this other outlet as non-credible, but you go article by article, you go paragraph by paragraph to determine for yourself what you think is likely to be accurate and what is not.
Paragraph by paragraph. It's really kind of amazing what it requires to be an informed citizen right now, isn't it?
I think it requires being on a media diet.
A media diet? Want to say more about that?
Yeah. Again, this is probably, people in the room like myself who remember we used to get the news once a day, like 10 o'clock at night or whatever the nightly news hour, and in the morning with your newspaper. That was it. Today, it's in our hands, it's in our face every waking moment. It's always there. And we are suddenly responsible for knowing what's happening with a few dozen different news stories at any given time, which means you cannot achieve any real depth on any topic. So if you cut out 90% of your media consumption and go deep on 2 or 3 topics, I think you do yourself a much bigger favor than this kind of like passive browsing that I know I do, that doesn't give me any depth on a particular topic unless I'm writing about it.
How many of you take an electronic Sabbath, turn off your phones for a few hours, maybe make one day or a half a day? It's an amazing thing. You'll twitch in the beginning, but then you'll appreciate it. Yeah. Well, let's talk about AI for a second. There are several questions about AI, about how it could affect, what impact could AI have to help identify the deep fakes. And if the New York Times prints the truth and AI gets its truth from the New York Times, then the New York Times influence could be unstoppable. So another question is, why is the New York Times suing Microsoft? Won't AI seek its truth elsewhere? And I want to bundle one more question, if I could, Ashley, and that is, do you think AI will finally find the truth on its own and bypass all these liars? That was actually my husband's question the night I talked to Ashley for the very first time.
Yeah, that's a great question. AI obviously everything about it is huge. It is already impacting all of us in our lives, and it will impact the news as well. AI, the beautiful thing about AI is that it does whatever you train it to do. So if you wanted to train it to lie to you, it will. If you want to train it to do what ChatGPT does, which is put a trust and safety layer on top of it that has sort of, a fairly familiar set of beliefs behind it that you can recognize, then you can do that. a colleague of mine named David Rosato created what he called right-wing GPT, not because he's right-wing, which he's not, but he wanted to show the bias that was built in to the OpenAI version. But I think one thing that we can do that's actually not that hard, I tried to do it and it works, which is you can use AI to check facts, cross-check a fact against as many search results as you want, and search results that you can say these are the good outlets and these are the bad. You can check at a sentence level for structural issues with bias. There's so much that can be done with media reliability and AI, putting aside generating news, which is, I think, actually a harder question. Why are they suing? The New York Times is suing OpenAI because OpenAI presumably used New York Times information to train its model. It probably used everybody's information to choose. So if you want to sue OpenAI as well, go for it. I don't know where that suit's going to go. I don't know how you create a model that can compensate all these different content producers for their contribution to training these models. We're going to see how this plays out in the next 5 to 10 years. I think it's going to take quite a time. Okay.
Can you comment on the British intelligence role in attacking Trump? And then there's some names listed, but Christopher Steele, Stephen Halper, I'm going to not go through the names, but
yeah.
Do you have a sense about that?
I don't know anything about the British intelligence services or agencies participating. Christopher Steele, at the time he was hired by the Clinton campaign, he was actually hired by the opposition research company that attacked Trump. They hired a former spy, probably many of you know, named Christopher Steele. The really important thing here from my point of view is that everyone just believed in the media. Everyone just believed that this was all credible stuff. I mean, it was on its face of it not credible. There were rumors flying around that the Clinton campaign was putting this into the world purposefully, as they were proven later to be doing, and no one reported on that. So this is, I think, with COVID, Russiagate is probably the journalistic failure of our generation, is my guess. I recommend everybody read, there was a Columbia Journalism Review 3 or 4-part article by Jeff Gerth, who was a New York Times investigative reporter, chronicling how Russiagate was constructed, how it failed, why almost none of the core claims were borne out, and how the media essentially just covered it up. And this is, Jeff Gerth is one of their own. He is a highly regarded Pulitzer Prize winning reporter. He wrote this massive piece in Columbia Journalism Review, and it did not make a peep. It was complete and total silence. And that's also why no major newsroom made their editor available to him for an interview, because they know exactly what happened.
That's really amazing. Of course, Columbia is one of the supposedly greatest journalism schools in the country, right? But let's not bypass what you just said, the Pulitzer Prize. Okay, so after reading your book and understanding that they didn't, the New York Times is called out on horrible things that they won prizes for, including one day forgetting to mention that 700,000 Jews were killed, not in totality, but in one report. They buried it on page 5 or something in a couple of paragraphs, right? Yeah. So what in the world does the Pulitzer Prize mean anymore, and why would anyone accept one?
Yeah, the New York Times is, I always encourage people to think about it as an ecosystem, which it is. And in the ecosystem, you have other news organizations, but then you have these support institutions, like the Pulitzer Prize. And frequently you have, colleagues and friends of people who are at the news organizations on the committees of these prizes. And what it does is that it kind of just gives this gloss of truth to whatever gets the prize. So, for example, there were 3 different people in the Berlin bureau I mentioned earlier that was infiltrated by a Nazi. 3 of them wrote stories of that nature, and 2 of them received Pulitzers, including one of them for the Olympics that he called the greatest sporting event of all time. When we think about Nicole Hannah-Jones, who printed what dozens of scholars came out and said were just not true, including the New York Times' own fact checker on an important fact about the Revolutionary War. She printed this false fact. It was just wrong. She won a Pulitzer. But what it does is you get the Pulitzer, and then you get the book deal, and then you get the kids' book deal, and then you get the 1619 project into the high school curricula, and then the ecosystem becomes complete. So I think for the Pulitzer, it's a lot about playing that role of the glaze and the gloss. A lot of the Russiagate Pulitzers, no one's even asked for them to be returned. It's not even a question. So, and Durante's has not been returned either.
It's getting to be like the Nobel Peace Prize. Not quite as meaningful. I think they should change it to like the Audacity Award or something. Okay, so questions about, I'm going to shift gears here. Relationship to the BLM protesters to the pro-Hamas protesters. And I'm asked, Ashley's obviously got firsthand experience in Israel, so we're taking advantage of his inside knowledge.
I mean, I think what we're seeing, it looks familiar. I think it kind of rhymes, I think this is I think it does, a lot of the protests are Trump driven, like they were for BLM. Of course, there are real issues there. It's not to deny those issues. Those issues are meaningful. And again, I feel the same way about the 1619 project. It's an issue that should be addressed. Slavery in America should be addressed. The question is how it's done. With the 1619 project, it could have been done in the same way with adhering to the facts. And I think with BLM and the pro-Palestine demonstrations, to demonstrate en masse is a great thing. It's a democratic principle. But to keep it, within the realm of the law-abiding and the civil, obviously it's not always possible. But I think when you add in a political element and potential incentives from people who have an interest in seeing chaos increase at the time, then things go wrong.
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads into the next question, which why are there no consequences for all these lies?
Yeah. Well, I think there are. I think there are consequences. I think the truth, obviously, it travels much more slowly than the lies do. Sometimes that's by design. I think one thing I saw with regard to the origin of COVID story was that the Chinese government and various scientific institutions were so adept at just throwing stuff into the pot. You just throw more and more lies, facts, fiction. They didn't mind if some facts slipped in there. It just made it all better. Because what it does, it creates a stew. It's a stew about lies about pangolins and about...
Pangolins, remember pangolins? How many did you had to look that up?
Yeah, we
the heck was a pangolin?
So excited about pangolins for 3 weeks. And it was just a lie, it was a hoax. But once you throw enough stuff into the pot and you cook it, what it means is that for people like myself, investigators or journalists or whoever they are, you can't even figure out what the ingredients are. You can't disentangle it. So journalists, and there have been people doing this full-time, and I'm not one of them, but full-time on the COVID story for the last 2-3 years, still trying to figure out the facts on the ground. And that's how a lot of this works, is that the lies are fast and the truth is really slow. But I really do think what we're seeing right now, the shift in the culture, is the consequence for the lies that have been carried out. People, once you lose that trust, which is so valuable, where today 2/3 of people in America think that the media is not objective or neutral. They have lost that trust, and I think that is the biggest consequence that they could possibly endure.
I think that Gelman, is that how you describe it? Gelman.
Yeah.
Amnesia is a really, really important point, because how many of you have ever actually been written about and found errors in the piece or a story that you knew firsthand, right? But it's true. We don't look at the next piece over and say, well, that's probably a lot of lies too. But we want to believe something. It's almost like you need some kind of solid earth to proceed.
I think that's actually okay, though, because the next story over could be a really good story. That's the thing about the news, is that, and this is the bundling and debundling effect, The brand, the news brand should tell you nothing. It should not tell you if this is a credible or non-credible news outlet. It should only just be a label. Credibility should come from the news reporting itself, from that article itself. Is that article telling you people familiar with, sources familiar with, people say, some people say, or are they giving you specific facts and details that you need to know to understand the story? There's a difference between those two stories, and we all know what that difference is. So I think it is for us to go story by story and look, be like, this story, I just don't get a good feeling out of something here. They're not telling me the facts. They're not giving me the full picture. There seems to be a political incentive here. I'm going to put this one aside and then move over and see, maybe the next one is actually better.
Yeah. I want to just circle back to those pangolins. Jay, could you let us know if we have a pangolin emergency again? Because you're so close to the forum, and we really would appreciate it. I know we're supposed to be worried about Alaska pox now, but if there's some kind of animal, and most of us can't define it, I'd love to hear from you first. Okay, now I feel like the elephant in the room has to be mentioned, and because so much damage was done, obviously, to the Jewish people through what happened at the New York Times. It's really appalling, and the rise of anti-Semitism is just so apparent. So, Ashley, would you speak? This is pretty heartbreaking, but would you speak to the I don't know what else to call it nicely. It's just really self-hating Jews creating anti-Semitism.
Yeah, well, at the Times, that definitely played a role. I mentioned the cover-up of the Holocaust. They printed 6 front-page stories in 6 years about the first mechanized genocide in human history. And the reason they did that was because they belonged to a particular form of Judaism that didn't see Jews as a people or a nation. They just saw it as a kind of worship, like some people worship in a church and these people worship in a synagogue, which meant that there was no sense to a Holocaust targeted at one nationality because they didn't believe that that nationality actually exists. They implanted their own ideology on top of reality. And I think this is the core notion where we talk about ideological capture. The core danger with this kind of thing is that you put your own views as an individual on top of the reality of millions of other people who have a completely different experience, and you do that to serve your own interest. And that's exactly what they did. They were serving an ideological interest. They were serving also a financial interest. They did not want to be seen as a Jewish newspaper at a time when anti-Semitism was high in America. That would not be good for their business. So they made a decision which was, a selfish one, which is one that corporations make all the time, dynasties make all the time, because you get to a point of wealth and power that truth is a distant third to maintaining the wealth and maintaining the power. And I believe that's what it is for the Sulzbergers.
The National Science Foundation seems to be up to maybe something that's not so clear. Could you talk a little bit about that and exactly what we're paying for?
Yeah, you're talking about Track F.
Yeah. I believe that's what we're referring to.
Sorry?
Track F, I believe that is what the question refers to.
So the National Science Foundation is dedicating tens of millions in funding to combat misinformation, disinformation, using censorship. That's the tool. That's the solution.
Ashley, can I interrupt you for a second? Was the word misinformation ever used before COVID? I don't remember here. Did you guys use that word? Misinformation.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't as much of a meme as it became today. I mean, it's now, and disinformation, of course, Russian. You almost want to say Russia when you say disinformation because you're trained. So the question about Track F, the government is directing. I think what happened was they saw that with the Twitter files, it was very blunt. It was the FBI and the CIA, State Department, whoever it was, and Schellenberger and Taibbi and Barry Weiss and all those guys did an amazing job with, I believe, working with Jay on some of this stuff. But it was kind of ham-handed in a way where it's like they left a record, right? You're leaving a paper trail with the CIA saying, please don't say this, and the FBI saying, please do say this. So I think what they're doing is they're learning. And they're learning that if you got to go farther upstream in the flow of information to exert control. You don't want to exert it at the point where it's already being expressed on Twitter. Now you've got to come in and do this mop-up stuff. They want to go higher up that chain, and the highest you can go is creation of information, which is what generative AI literally does. It generates information. If they can shape those models that are being created, if they can shape the ideas that are being used to inform ethics about the AI models, then you have a lot of power to influence not just any given conversation, but all the conversations. It's almost like what the NSA does at a level of data gathering, where they're just gathering literally everything. Now, they're this is the reverse. They are the top of the pipe, the top of the funnel for all the information going out into the world as well through AI. So
Your
I
tax
think it's,
dollars hard at work.
It is, yeah. It's up to $40 million at this point, I think, or a bit more. But it's a dangerous path.
Wow, it's unsettling. Okay. Well, Ashley, I think everybody here would be curious. By the way, I highly recommend reading Ashley's book. Ashley, they can get it on Amazon. Is there another place you'd like to recommend getting it?
No, Amazon will get you the best deal. I'll tell you that.
It actually really is. It's a really good, well-written and well-researched book, and they can also find you on Twitter. And is there anywhere else that you want people to look for you?
Yeah, Amazon, Twitter is great.
Okay. So Ashley says, whenever you see a journalist looking at a potentially huge scoop and publicly saying, nope, nothing to see here, you know there is something to see. Ashley Rindsberg has done his homework, and we are grateful that you brought your tenacity for truth, your affection for truth to Silicon Valley here tonight. We so much appreciate you.
Thank you.
With
Thank
us.
you so much for having me.
Thank you. Ashley Rindsberg.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you for watching our presentation. Please like and subscribe to our channel to get updates on new speakers, and consider joining the Liberty Forum of Silicon Valley. You can do so at our website. If you don't want to join, but want to support the principles of American liberty, you can make a tax-deductible donation via our website. The links are in the description. Thank you again, and stay free.